Alright guys, we're going to be talking some comics today because I have picked up the second release from Rippaverse Comics, which is of course ISOM number 2. So this is cover B. I did pick this up back during the campaign, which was this past summer, I think, but I haven't gotten around to doing this video yet. So we will be talking about this book and going through it, kind of like I did with the first release from them. So this is part 2 of the ill-advised arc, which, before we get into spoilers and talking about the story and such, just as far as the quality of the actual item goes, of course it is the same excellent quality that the first one was. This one does have a glossy cover, you may have noticed, unlike the first issue that had a more matte finish, at least on cover C, the one I got. So, glossy cover, very nice book, excellent, page quality and everything. It is slightly thicker than the first one. The first book, I believe, was about 96 pages or thereabouts. This one is, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 112 or so. So, a little bit more content for the same price. So, overall, the product itself is an excellent book. Now, some brief thoughts again on the story before we get into any specifics. I did think the story was good. I actually think I did like this one more than the first book. It was definitely a lot less grounded than the first one was. We definitely veered off into a lot more of the supernatural and, for lack of a better word, comic booky sort of area in this one. We did get introduced to a lot of new characters again, just like in the first book. Also, there was a lot more action in this book, so that made it more exciting and kind of more of a fun read. So, I did enjoy reading it. Now, we will be going through the story now, so if you haven't read it and you don't want to be spoiled, you have been warned. So, anyway, starting off, we did see Altona about to go into her office at Projexus, and we find out her actual job position. She is the Chief Technology Officer, so we know her official job title now. But anyway, she's going into her office, and when she gets inside, she discovers that Darren Fontano is there, the antagonist that we met in the first book. So Darren is inside with some of his henchmen, and he's there to try to get information from Altona about Avery and sort of things that he can do after his encounter with him in the first book. So, of course, Altona is not going to tell him anything. So, he actually ends up hauling off and just slapping her in the face, which I thought was great. It's not great, but it was a great villain move. It made you just really hate him. So, that was a cool villain move for Darren. But he slaps her in the face and pulls a gun on her and is trying to force her to talk. So, she ends up getting saved by the founder of Projexus showing up, which is another new character that we're meeting for the first time here. And his name is Lincoln Eusebio. I think I'm pronouncing that right. But anyway, he shows up with his security guys, and he ends up kicking Darren and his crew out of the building. And he actually gut punches Darren on the way out. So, this guy's pretty cool. He just comes busting in and saves the day. He's clearly going to be one of our protagonists. He's helping out Altona. And Darren obviously is going to have some conflict with him since they're both these two, sort of big power players, in the city. So, after that, we actually went immediately into a flashback from a few years ago. Which, in the build-up to the release of this book, one of the big things that was promoted was we were going to find out why Avery quit being ISOM in the first place. So that's what we got here. We got a flashback, and we see what looks like a comic book convention that has been destroyed by something. And we see two people inside. One of them's just like a nerdy convention-goer guy, and the other one is a cosplayer girl. So they're sort of hiding in the rubble from whatever did this. And ISOM comes in to save them and help them get out of the building. And on the way out, they end up running into the thing that did this, which is another new character named Chadrayan. I guess that's how you say that. I'm not totally sure on some of these name pronunciations, but I'm going to go with Chadrayan. So we meet him, who is this big, muscle-bound, hulking dude who looks very alien. I don't know if he's supposed to be alien or from another dimension or what. But we see this guy, he is speaking some sort of language that Avery cannot understand. So Avery ends up trying to fight him, which does not go very well. He ends up getting his ass kicked, actually. And Chadrayan goes after the cosplayer girl and gets a hold of her. And Avery tries his best to save her, but in the end he ultimately fails, and Chadrayan kills her. So this event is what traumatized Avery and made him decide to stop being a hero. His failure to save this girl. So after this, we cut back to Avery sitting with Cedric, who again we met in the first book, owner of Taylorsville, the guy that made his suit. So Cedric is talking to him about that event and about how, even if you couldn't save everyone, your inaction and your decision to stop being a hero has cost more lives, because you could have at least been saving some people, if not everyone. So he ends up giving Avery the condition of not quitting anymore if it gives him his suit back. So Avery ends up agreeing to it. So I thought this was a pretty cool conversation between the two of them. It sort of established Cedric as sort of like a mentor figure a little bit to Avery, I guess. So next, after this, we cut to Avery, who is returning to his ranch, and we get a follow-up to one of the cliffhangers from the first book, which, if you remember in that book, there was a scene where Sam pulls his gun and goes to enter the security building because he thought someone was in there. So in this one, Avery pulls up and the door to the security building is still open. So he thinks Sam has been in there all night and left the door open. So he kind of casually goes in to investigate. And inside, he is confronted by these two giant creatures. They're these ape-like monster things that actually look really cool. I love the designs for these. So he encounters these things. I don't know exactly what you want to call them. Later in the book, they're referred to as Hellions, but I'm not sure if that's supposed to be their official name or just what the characters at the time were referring to them as. But anyway, Avery gets into a fight with these things now, and one of them actually ends up clawing Avery in the shoulder and injuring his shoulder. So these things warn him that he will be seeing him soon, which we don't know who he is quite yet. But they give Avery that warning, and then they burst into flames and burn the entire building down. So Avery manages to escape, but his entire security building is on fire now. So once he's outside, the other ranch hands come up to try to help. And one of them mentioned that they've already called Gooding. So at this point, we are introduced to another new character. So Gooding is this guy who has a bunch of like robot companions that he's built. He's got these little flying drones that he sent over to, shoot out water and put out the fire. He also had this little like kind of robot dog looking dude who was his helper. It had some wings that came out of him at one point too, so I guess this little dog thing can fly. But he's got all these cool robot companions. And we go to find out that Gooding actually offers up like this subscription service that you can pay monthly for. And it's sort of like an emergency response service for people who live in the more rural areas outside of Flores Park. So he offers fire extinguishing and, medical help and criminal investigations and all sorts of things. So this guy's sort of like a jack of all trades, rural helper guy that you can pay for, which I think is a pretty unique concept. Instead of him just being like, a do-gooding hero, he's actually turned it into a business model, and he's charging people for it. So it's kind of like the superhero equivalent of insurance, I guess. So that's a pretty unique concept. So Gooding shows up and uses his robots to help put out the fire. And then briefly it cuts away to another scene elsewhere in the city where we get a brief scene with the Alpha Core, actually, which this is the only appearance of Alpha Core in this book. And it's just a brief follow-up to the brief scene we had with them in the first book, where they're talking about their encounter with Yaira and how Brian encountered her once before, and she left, but now she's back. And this is really more just a teaser to set up for the next book that Rippaverse is putting out, which is Alpha Core #1, which is actually going to dive into their story in full. So this, I think, was mostly just to set up more hype for that. The one cool thing we did get out of this little scene, though, was we found out that Alpha Core actually has a floating base that flies around the city, so that's pretty fucking cool. But anyway, next we go back to Avery, and he's returning home after the whole ordeal earlier with the beasts attacking him, and he's trying to get some rest after everything he's gone through, and he immediately gets a call from Altona, who is telling him what happened earlier with Darren showing up. And Lincoln is on the call too, and he's, trying to tell Avery that everything's fine, and he's got Altona and Vassy, staying under protection so nothing will happen to them. So Avery ends up hanging up on him and getting really angry and saying that he's going to go kill Darren over this because he went after his sister. So then we get a scene with Darren, who's at Club Merc, and he actually ends up calling in Santuan, who was the guy that Avery fought in the first book. And he's trying to get some info out of Santuan about Avery and what he can do, and Santuan doesn't want to cooperate with him. So Darren actually ends up firing him and kicking him out of the building. So Santuan is no longer under Darren's employ. And then Darren does end up telling one of his henchwomen to make sure that Jasmine comes back to his office. So we got a brief mention of Jasmine, which this was really all we got out of the Darren plotline in this book, because we end up kind of going off into another story here, and we never really went back to it. So that's all the follow-up to the whole plotline with Darren and Jasmine and all that until ISOM #3. So next we got another little world-building scene, which I actually really like this since I'm a wrestling fan. We got a scene from the TV, actually, that Lincoln was watching, about the SSWL, the Southern Style Wrestling League, which is the wrestling promotion that Cedric actually mentioned in the first book about how he had, made some ring gear for people in that. So we see a scene from this wrestling show, and we're introduced to another new character named Larry Shungite. Again, I think I'm pronouncing that right. So we see him come out to the ring, and he's cutting a promo about losing the championship. And that's really all we got out of it. The scene sort of transitioned to Lincoln watching this on the TV and then cutting it off and going into the next scene. So we didn't get much out of that, but it was a brief glimpse of the SSWL. And I just thought that was cool. Like I said, I am a big wrestling fan, so the prospect of, maybe a potential future book focused on Larry Shungite or a wrestler character or something like that is very interesting to me. I have no idea if Larry is an accept or anything like that, but, there's a lot of ways they could go with that, and I'm kind of intrigued by it. So next we see Lincoln again, and he's leaving the building, and out in the parking garage he ends up running into this woman named Sally. And he's having a really nice conversation with Sally about offering her a job, and she's doing some sort of consulting work for them. So anyway, they seem to be getting along, but as she's walking away, we see Sally's hair start to change color, and it is revealed that Sally is in fact Yaira. So this was a brief Yaira appearance, the only one in this book, but that gives us another glimpse into what she's doing. She is working with Projexus at some level. We don't know for what purpose or what she's doing exactly, But again, we also have a Yaira #1 book coming up very soon. I think February is when they're planning on launching the campaign for that one. So we will, again, dive into her story in full in that one. But we did get a brief glimpse of Yaira in this book to chew on until then. So anyway, as Lincoln is leaving, he's driving away with one of his employees named Jason, and they end up getting attacked by some of Darren's guys, and it's revealed that Jason is actually working for Darren, which in the scene earlier, Lincoln did mention that he had fired all of the moles that Darren had working for him at Projexus. So apparently he missed one, and Jason is one of them. So Jason was actually trying to help Darren kill Lincoln this entire time. So Lincoln actually ends up crashing the car and diving out through the windshield to escape. So that was a pretty cool scene. That's also the last we see of Lincoln in this book. So this guy's clearly resourceful, and actually liked him pretty good. I look forward to seeing some more of him in the future as well. So then we go back to Avery, who is leaving his house, and on the way out, he runs into Sam's wife, actually, who is wondering where the fuck Sam is, because he still hasn't come home. So Avery ends up taking her to Gooding, and we end up meeting some more of his robot companions that help them into the building. So once they get inside, Avery ends up telling Sam's wife what happened to him earlier, and that Sam was missing, and he got attacked by these weird gorilla monster things. So, after hearing that news, she promptly passes out. And Avery and Gooding go to working on figuring out what's actually going on here. So, we actually end up having a really interesting conversation here between Avery and Gooding in this scene, where we have the first explicit mention of something that you knew about if you read some of the supplemental stuff from the first campaign, but this is the first time it's mentioned in the books, I believe. Because they mentioned the Great War of Separation, which, from what little we know about it, apparently in this world, Texas has seceded from the United States and has become its own country. So, that's a very interesting concept that they're going to be able to explore in the future. We know that Brian Solari, the head guy from the Alpha Corps, he served in the war, and he apparently was one of the big heroes of it. So, we don't really know much about that. It was kind of just mentioned in passing here. But Gooding talks about during the war, some weird creatures showed up during it, and they had some sort of molecule in them that Gooding managed to find at the scene of the fire earlier today. So he thinks that the creatures that attacked Avery are similar to the creatures that were appearing during the Great War. So he doesn't really know what's going on, but he has a few ideas. So he ends up giving Avery this little gold card looking thing. And he tells Avery to go talk to a friend of his who he thinks can help them. So Avery goes back home, and when he gets home, his suit has arrived from Cedric, so he's got his new and improved ISOM suit now. So he spends a few days getting ready, but he gets his new suit on, and he heads out to the location that Gooding told him about to find his friend. So when he gets there, he finds this huge butt-fucking castle out in the middle of nowhere, which is actually pretty cool looking. So he goes up to this castle, and he is immediately attacked by a bunch of animals. A crow comes down and pecks on his neck, and he gets attacked by these big, like, demon wolf-looking things, and then a moat full of alligators, and then a big fucking wyvern comes flying down. And at this point, we are introduced to another new character, which was my favorite character in this book, at least. We are introduced to Sydney Bloodruth. So, she's a very cool character. She's definitely more on the supernatural side. And all these animal friends that attacked Avery are her pets, I guess, for lack of a better word, familiars, I don't know. But anyway, she's got control of all these animals. So, they're all her friends. So, Avery ends up explaining to her that, Gooding sent him, and he's here to try to find out what happened to Sam. So they end up going inside the castle, and Bloodruth is trying to help. And we end up with another actually really interesting conversation here, where Bloodruth is talking about the creatures that burned down Avery's building. And they talk about how they look like they might have came from hell, and how all these different cultures have, stories about hell or their own versions of hell. And she mentions that these creatures might have came from a different dimension. And we have a very important world building note here, so she sort of explains what she means by dimensions. And it's made clear that these dimensions are not different universes, which Eric has gone on record many times talking about how he does not like the multiverse concept that is very often used in comics or other media. So these are not alternate universes or alternate Earths or alternate timelines or what have you. These are different dimensions that exist within this one world. And she believes that this may be where these creatures are coming from, but she doesn't know why they're here or how they got here. So Bloodruth ends up telling Avery that she knows of a cave nearby where she thinks that these things might be concentrated at. So her and Avery end up going to this cave, and they ride there on her wyvern, which is just a fucking cool way to travel. So they go to this cave, and of course when they get inside, it is full of these ape-like creatures that attacked Avery's building earlier. So they get inside, and they start fighting them, and we get our first look at some of the things that Bloodruth can do, because she is an Accept, and she does have powers. And I guess the best way to describe them is sort of bloodmancy, I suppose. She can have blood come out of her fingernails, and she can control it and manipulate it, and she seems to be able to charge some sort of power into it. She can make it glow and explode and use it offensively. So we don't have all the details, but she does have blood-based powers, which is pretty fucking cool. So her and Avery fight their way through this cave, and they end up finding a big area where a bunch of these things are at, and they have some sort of like little storage cell or whatever in there. So Avery gives Bloodruth a boost to get up there, while he fights off the creatures below. So again, she uses her blood powers to blow a hole in the wall, and once she gets inside, she finds a room full of dead bodies, and Sam, who is not dead, but he's in there with them. So she's going to rescue Sam and get him out. And as they're leaving, we get a shot of Sam's back, and we notice that these creatures have carved some sort of markings into his back that start glowing. So we don't know what that's about, but these creatures have done something to Sam. So I'm sure that's going to come into play later. But anyway, they go to leave, and in order to get down, Bloodruth uses her powers again to create sort of these temporary blood platforms that they can hop down with. So they make it back to the ground, and Avery opens up a path for them to escape. So they're trying to run out, but at this point, Bloodruth is actually really drained, because apparently the more she uses her powers, the more it exhausts her. So Sam's actually having to help hold her up in some of these scenes, despite Sam being the one that they came in there to save. So they're trying to get out, and on the way out, they do get attacked by more of the creatures. And this time, some of Bloodruth's animal friends show up to help them, and we actually have a really cool scene where her demon wolves or whatever they are show up and attack some of the creatures, and those demon wolves can like turn into smoke or some shit, so that was cool. But anyway, they help them escape, so they get to the outside where her wyvern friend swoops down and carries them away. So they escape on the wyvern, and meanwhile Avery ends up fighting off the rest of them inside, and one of them's about to explode on top of him, and he launches that one off of him into the other ones and blows up the place in order to escape. So Avery makes it out as well, and that's the end of the book. So, very cool story. Again, a lot more supernatural than I was expecting, a lot less grounded than the, sort of gangster focused story of the first book. Now, there was one brief scene also at the end of this where we got a look of a different creature that seems to be the leader of these ape things. And he's talking about how Avery's a threat and they have to eliminate him. So we don't know what that dude's name is, but he looks very cool, and he's clearly some sort of leader for these things. So I like this story a lot. It did leave me with a lot more questions than even the first book did. We don't know what these creatures are. We don't know where they came from. We don't know why they're here. We don't know how, if at all, this ties into anything that Darren is doing. It didn't feel like it does. It kind of felt a little disjointed, actually, going from the Darren story to this, which we might find out later that they are linked somehow, but at least based on the information we have now, it seemed like totally different things. So there's a lot to speculate about there and think about there, which I think is very interesting. We got a really cool introduction to Bloodruth, which I just really liked her as a character a lot. I just thought she was really cool. Having blood-based powers, having animal companions, I just thought she was really awesome as a character. So I hope we see more of her. I'd be really surprised if we didn't end up getting a Bloodruth book at some point. I'm not the only one who's had a reaction like this to her. So she's obviously very popular, and I'd be stunned if Eric didn't capitalize on that and make an entire series just for her. So maybe this whole story with these creatures is going to be followed up on by her in her book, and we'll get more focus on it in that. We also don't know what's going to happen to Sam now since he's got those markings in his back. I don't think, it's just going to be a happy ending for him and everything's going to be fine. I think that's going to have something happen in regards to that in the future. But yeah, this was a very cool book. There was, again, no Dokumon in this book, just like in the first one. So we still have not seen him at all in the books yet. There was no Norfolka follow-up in this one. There was no more information on Michael and Lillian, who we saw in the first book. So we still have several threads that are dangling that we have not gotten any more info on yet. But of course that will be coming in future releases. So there are a few slight negatives that I do want to mention here. Most of them are very minor things, but again, like with the first book, there was a few typos. The most egregious of which was on an fictional ad page for Gooding's subscription service. They actually spelled Gooding's name wrong, which was pretty blatant. Which, to his credit, Eric has already addressed this, and he said that, they want to crack down on that in the future. So it's nice to see a company actually acknowledge their mistakes for once and promise to correct them and not try to blame someone else or pretend like it never happened in the first place or what have you. So I appreciate that from a business perspective, if nothing else. The only other thing, which, again, this is a small thing, but it absolutely drove me crazy. There are a few inconsistencies in the artwork that are sort of immersion breaking and distracting, or at least I found them that way. One example of this is with the creatures that attacked Avery. Like in one scene, one of them looks like the area between his horns is bald, but then in other scenes it looks like he has hair there, and it kind of went back and forth depending on what panel you were looking at. And again, that's something that doesn't really matter much, but it once you notice it, it really bothers you, or at least it does for me. Maybe I was the only one that noticed that, but I found it very distracting, so hopefully that's something that I can kind of pay more attention to in the future and not have things like that happen again. But yeah, overall, I did really like the book. I think it was a great effort. Definitely expanded the world a lot, definitely set up a lot of interesting stories for the future. I am 100% emotionally invested in this world, and financially invested as well, I guess. But I do plan on picking up all their future releases, at least at this point. the next one coming out here soon is Alpha Core #1, which I already have pre-ordered. I got it on the first day of the campaign, I believe, and fulfillment for that actually starts next week. So should be getting my hands on that pretty soon. Once I do, I will be making a video going through that book as well. Hopefully I can get it out in a more timely fashion than this one did. But that's the next book coming up. After that, I think Yaira #1 is next in line, and I believe it's scheduled for February of next year, at least for when the campaign starts. I think that's when Eric said they were aiming for anyway. So we got Alpha Core coming up. We got Yaira coming up. I don't know when ISOM #3 is going to be coming out sometime next year, I'm sure. But whenever it comes out, I will be getting it too. I believe it's supposed to be the conclusion to this ill-advised arc. So that should wrap up the story with Darren, at least, and Jasmine. So I'll be interested to see where they go in that. Which, like I said, I do wish we got a little bit more from that plot line in this book, but they kind of veered off into the whole thing with Blood Ruth and the creatures, which was very cool and very interesting, but it sort of left the Darren thing hanging a bit more than I would have liked. But yeah, overall, I did really like the book. Super excited for the future. It's really cool to see what Eric and his team are doing over there. So, yeah, I guess that's all I got to say. So, lots of luck to you and yours.